On the 14th of February, 1925, in a house in Washington, a woman of 41 gave birth to her only child and named the girl Paulina Longworth. But the man whose name the baby carried was almost certainly not her father. The father, on the weight of the evidence, was a sitting United States senator. The husband, a future Speaker of the House, took the child in and raised her as his own and asked nothing the world could hear. The woman at the center of it was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, daughter of one president, wife to the second most powerful man in the Congress, and intimate of a third. She would hold the truth of that Valentine's morning for the rest of her long life. It would take the country 80 years to learn what Washington had only ever whispered. If you want the real stories of the women who shaped power in America, the ones the record filed under a man's name, subscribe to Feminine Legacies so the next one finds you. Chapter 1. The child, born into a silence. She came into the world on the 12th of February 1884, and within 2 days, the two women who should have raised her were dead. Her mother was Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, 22 years old, married to a young New York assemblyman named Theodore Roosevelt. The birth went well enough. What no one had caught, hidden behind the ordinary strain of the pregnancy, was the illness that was killing the mother even as she delivered her daughter, a disease of the kidneys generally blamed for her death. On the 14th of February, in the family house on West 57th Street in Manhattan, the young mother died. In the same house, on the very same day, Theodore Roosevelt's own mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, died of typhoid fever. A husband lost his wife and his mother within a single span of hours, and a newborn girl lost, in one stroke, the entire world she had just entered. Theodore Roosevelt's response set the emotional weather of his daughter's whole childhood. In his diary for that day, he drew a single large mark across the page, a heavy crossed line, and beneath it he wrote that the light had gone out of his life. Then he did something that would shape the girl far more than any words. He closed the subject. He essentially refused ever to speak of his first wife again. He left her out of the autobiography he would later write. He did not encourage his daughter to ask about the mother whose name she carried, and the household followed his lead. The child was called Baby Lee in those first years, and the woman she was named for became the one topic the family would not discuss. Into that silence stepped the person who actually raised her. Theodore Roosevelt, shattered and restless, handed the infant into the care of his elder sister, Anna Roosevelt, known in the family as Bamie, and later as Auntie Bi. It was Bamie who gave the motherless baby her earliest steadiness, and Alice never forgot it. Late in her life, she said that there is always someone in every family who keeps it together, and that in hers, it was Auntie Bi. The line is affectionate, and it is also revealing, because it locates the warmth of her childhood, not in her famous father, but in the aunt who filled the space he could not. Her father did not stay a widower long. On the 2nd of December, 1886, when Alice was 2, Theodore Roosevelt married his childhood friend, Edith Kermit Carow, and the little girl was brought into a new household that would soon fill with other children. 5 half-siblings arrived across the following years: Theodore Jr., Kermit, Ethel, Archibald, and Quentin. And Alice grew up among them at Sagamore Hill on Long Island as the eldest and the different one. Edith asked to be called Mother, and Alice complied. And yet the sense of being the child of a marriage no one discussed never fully left her. The standard reading of her early years is that she never felt entirely wanted in her own home. The eldest child, and the one who belonged to the marriage, no one would name. It would be easy, and wrong, to tell this only as a wound. Alice herself, looking back from old age, was generous about it. She wrote that being the child of another marriage was a simple fact of her life, and that her stepmother coped with it with a fairness and a charm. The honesty of her own account matters, because it shows a woman who refused to be only a victim of her beginnings, even when she had every invitation to be. But the fact underneath the grace was real. She was the living reminder of the wife no one would name, and a child learns fast in a house like that. She learns that some truths are kept behind a closed door. She learns that a family can decide, together and without a word, what will and will not be spoken aloud. She learns that silence is not the same as absence, that a thing can be everywhere in a house and still never be said. There is one more turn of the knife in those first years, and it is the name. The baby was called Alice, the very name of the mother who had died bearing her, so that the child was a walking reminder of the loss no one would discuss. Her own name, a small daily echo of the woman the household would not speak of. She grew up as a living memorial to an absence, carrying in her own person the grief her father had sealed away. A child in that position learns something permanent about how the world handles pain. It does not always speak it. Sometimes it names a thing and then falls silent and lets the name do the remembering while the mouth stays shut. There was a physical mark on those years as well. From roughly the age of 10 to the age of 13, she wore braces on her legs, running from ankle to knee, to correct a weakness in her feet and legs, and the vigorous outdoor life her father prized could frighten a girl so equipped. She was not the effortless young athlete the Roosevelt name conjured. She was a watchful, clever, slightly set-apart child, learning to manage a world that had handed her a famous name, a dead mother she could not ask about, and a body that did not always cooperate. Out of all of it, she assembled the single lesson that would organize her entire life. She had grown up as the one subject her house would not discuss, and rather than be crushed by that silence, she studied it. She came to understand, earlier than almost anyone around her, that control over what is spoken and what is withheld is a form of power in itself. The girl who was the family's unspoken fact would grow into the woman who decided what an entire country was permitted to know. The classroom was a quiet house on Long Island. The examination would last 96 years. Chapter 2. The Daughter Who Would Not Be Governed. By 17, she was the most photographed young woman in America, and she had already worked out that attention was a currency she could spend. Her father became President of the United States on the 14th of September, 1901, when an assassin's bullet killed William McKinley and lifted Theodore Roosevelt into the White House. The awkward, watchful girl from Sagamore Hill walked into the most watched house in the country at exactly the age when a young woman is most closely scrutinized, and instead of shrinking from the gaze, she turned and met it. The press named her Princess Alice, and the country followed her the way a later age would follow film stars, for her personality rather than for any office she held. She gave them a great deal to follow. She smoked cigarettes in public at a time when respectable women did not, and the story spread that when her father forbade smoking under his roof, she simply climbed onto the roof of the White House and smoked there. She bet on horse races. She carried a pet garter snake she named Emily Spinach, green as spinach, and, by the joke of the day, as thin as a certain aunt of hers, and she was known to pull it from her bag at parties. Each of these was a small scandal, and together they made her a national character, the daughter who would not be told what to do. Her father felt the force of it directly. The line that survives from those years, reported from the White House, has him telling a visitor that he could either run the country or attend to Alice, but that he could not possibly do both. The exact wording has drifted between tellings and should be treated as approximate, but the substance is well attested, and it captures the truth of the situation. A president who bent the nation to his will could not govern his own eldest daughter, and she had discovered, at 17, that being ungovernable was itself a kind of power. A shade of soft blue-grey associated with her became a national craze known as Alice Blue, fixed in the popular memory by a song called Alice Blue Gown. A young woman had become a colour, a fashion, a headline, a habit of the whole country's attention. The reach of her fame is hard to convey to a later age. Songs were written about her. A colour was named for her and sold in shops across the country. Her clothes were copied, her sayings repeated, her movements followed by newspapers that knew their readers wanted her. She was, in the plainest sense, one of the first modern celebrities the United States ever produced, famous for being herself rather than for any office or deed. And she grasped the nature of that fame from the inside, as a thing she could shape and steer. The girl who had been the unspoken fact of a quiet house had become the most spoken of young woman in a loud and watching country, and she had done it, deliberately, by refusing every instruction to behave. The deeper thing she was learning was that this attention could be put to use. In the year 1905, her father sent a large congressional delegation across the Pacific to Asia, led by his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, and Alice went with it. The mission traveled to Hawaii, to Japan, to the Philippines, to China, and to Korea. And everywhere it went, the crowds came less for the officials than for the president's famous daughter. She served as an informal ambassador, a piece of living goodwill, and she understood the assignment perfectly. The most repeated story from the voyage has her jumping fully clothed into the ship's swimming pool and coaxing a congressman in after her, a stunt that delighted the newspapers back home. The theatrical details of that scene have the polish of an oft-told tale, but the fact beneath it is solid. Her celebrity had become an instrument of American statecraft, and she was the one wielding it. Consider the arithmetic of the era, because it makes what she was doing far more remarkable. A woman in 1905 could not vote. The professions were almost entirely shut to her. A young woman of Alice's intelligence and ambition had, in the formal sense, no path to power at all, no office to seek, no ballot to cast, no career to climb. The only influence on offer to her ran through the men she was attached to and through the public's regard for her, and that second channel, the regard of the public, was the one she had seized with both hands. She had taken the single instrument an ambitious woman of her time was permitted, her own fame, and she had made herself impossible to ignore across an entire nation and useful to the government of it. None of this was accident, and none of it was mere rebellion for its own sake. The watchful child had become a calculating young woman who understood the machinery of image from the inside, because she had grown up inside a president's household and a former president's before that. She knew that a reputation was a thing built on purpose and held under pressure. She knew that the public's affection could be cultivated and directed. She had learned, in a house that would not speak of her mother, exactly how much power lives in the management of what people see and what they are told. And now she was practicing that power on the largest stage the country had. By the time she was in her early 20s, she was the finished article, the most famous unmarried woman in the United States, a celebrity in the fullest modern sense before the word had settled into the language. What she needed next was an arena large enough to spend all of it, a marriage and a role that would take everything she had learned about attention and constraint and demand more. The man who would give her that arena was already in the House of Representatives, already watching her, already known for the appetites that would test her for the rest of her life. Chapter 3. The bride the whole country watched. On the 17th of February, 1906, she married inside the White House, and the wedding was a coronation in all but name. The groom was Nicholas Longworth III, a Republican congressman from Ohio, and the ceremony in the East Room drew the fascinated attention of the entire country. The most famous young woman in America was marrying from the president's own house, and the newspapers treated it as the national event it was. For a young woman who had spent her life being watched, it was the most watched day of all, the moment her celebrity and her father's power met under one roof and were sealed. The man she married was a study in contrasts, and every contrast mattered. He was about 14 years older than she was, born on the 5th of November, 1869, into one of the oldest and wealthiest families of Cincinnati, Ohio. The Longworth fortune reached back to his great-grandfather, Nicholas Longworth I, who had built it in the first half of the 19th century out of Cincinnati real estate and out of Catawba wine, and who was remembered as one of the richest men of his city and as a father of the American wine industry. A precise figure for the family's wealth has not survived in any reliable form, and it does not need one. What the record establishes is the scale of the thing, an old and dominant fortune in a major American city, the kind of money that had been powerful for 3 generations before Alice ever met its heir. Nicholas Longworth himself was cultivated and charming, a gifted violinist, and, by the well-attested reputation that followed him through his whole public life, a heavy drinker and a pursuer of women. The marriage that began in the glow of the East Room would be marked, from fairly early, by infidelity on both sides and by his drinking. That was the private truth underneath the public splendor, and it is essential to the whole story, because the woman standing at that altar was not a naive girl walking blind into disappointment. She had grown up watching how public marriages and private conduct were held apart. She married Nicholas Longworth with her eyes open, an alliance between the president's celebrated daughter and a rising man from a powerful congressional family, and she understood from the start that her task would be to manage a force rather than to reform one. Set the marriage against the world it happened in, and its terms come clear. In 1906, a married woman across much of the country still lived under the long shadow of coverture, the old legal doctrine that folded a wife's identity into her husband's, her property, her earnings, and her standing before the law absorbed into his. American women would not win the vote for another 14 years. A bride, however famous, was marrying into an order that expected her to vanish into her husband's name and career, to become an ornament of his ambition rather than a holder of her own. That was the arrangement Alice entered in the East Room of the White House before the fascinated eyes of the entire country at the age of 22. And the whole of her life afterward would be a steady, deliberate refusal to meet its expectation. She kept her own fame, her own politics, and in time her own secrets, inside a marriage the era had built to erase her. The wedding presented a young woman being handed from a father's house to a husband's. What it actually delivered to her was a platform, and she would spend the next 50 years proving how little a husband's name could contain her. There is a detail in the match that the era would have noticed at once. Longworth was some 14 years older than his bride, a man of established habits, marrying the most watched young woman in the country, and the gap in age was matched by a gap in temperament between the disciplined public performer and the charming, unfaithful congressman. The marriage went forward all the same, because Alice had chosen, and choosing, for herself, was the whole pattern of her character. She had refused to be governed as a girl. She would not be governed into or out of a marriage as a woman. The alliance was, in the language of the era, an excellent one, and it placed Alice exactly where her talents could work. She was now the daughter of a president and the wife of a rising congressman, a woman with a foot in the executive mansion and a foot in the Capitol, and the social and political worlds of Washington opened to her completely. She had spent her girlhood learning that a woman's power ran through the men she was attached to and through her own command of public regard. Now she was attached, by blood to the presidency and by marriage to the Congress, and her command of public regard was already total. The instrument was assembled. What remained was to see how she would play it, and how much the man beside her would cost her in the playing. Here, Act 1 of her life closes, at the height of her early power, the moment of maximum promise before consequence begins. She had converted a motherless, watched, slightly wounded girlhood into national celebrity, and national celebrity into a marriage at the summit of American public life. She was in her early 20s, famous beyond any private citizen of her age, allied to power on two sides, and married to a charming, ambitious, and unfaithful man whose family had been rich and powerful since before she was born. Everything she had learned about silence and attention and the management of a story was about to be tested by a marriage that would give her the two things her life had so far withheld: a genuine arena for her gifts and a secret worth keeping. Chapter 4. A marriage of two who strayed. They were married for a quarter of a century, and by the accounts that survive, both of them drank, and both of them strayed, and both of them stayed. This is the hard, unsentimental centre of the Longworth marriage, and it has to be stated plainly, because the whole later drama grows directly out of it. Nicholas Longworth's pursuit of other women ran through the marriage as a settled pattern, an accepted feature of his character among the people who knew him. His drinking was part of the same picture. And Alice, over the years, was not the passive casualty of any of it. She built a life and, in time, a relationship of her own alongside the marriage, and the union held together not through fidelity, but through a kind of mutual tolerance that let each of them survive the other. It would be a mistake to read this as simple misery, and an equal mistake to read it as a modern arrangement freely chosen. It was something harder than either. Divorce, for people of their standing and their moment, was close to unthinkable, a public catastrophe that neither the Roosevelt family nor the Longworth position could easily absorb. So the marriage became a structure to be managed rather than a romance to be repaired. Alice brought to that management the exact skills of her girlhood. She had learned as a child that a household can hold an unspoken truth at its centre and go on functioning around it. Now she lived inside such a household as an adult, and she governed her portion of it with the composure of someone who had been in training for the role since she was small. The strain in the marriage was not only personal, it was political, and the politics cut to the bone. Alice was her father's daughter in temperament and in loyalty, and when Theodore Roosevelt broke with the Republican Party to lead the insurgent progressive movement in 1912, the fracture ran straight through her marriage. Her father was now the leader of a rebellion against the sitting Republican president, William Howard Taft, and her husband, Nicholas Longworth, was a regular Republican who stayed loyal to Taft and to the party. Husband and wife stood on opposite sides of the fiercest political fight of the year, and Alice did not soften her own allegiance to spare the marriage. She stood with her father. The cost of that stand was immediate and public. In the three-way split that the progressive revolt produced, Nicholas Longworth lost his seat in the House of Representatives in the election of 1912, going down to a Democrat named Stanley Bodle by a narrow margin. And Alice had made no secret of standing with her father's insurgency, even as it split the party that had carried her husband. He would regain the seat in 1914 and rebuild his career, but the episode revealed something permanent about Alice. She would not subordinate her politics to her husband's convenience, even when the price landed on the household she shared with him. The independence this took is easy to underestimate from a distance. In the 1890s and the early 1900s, the doctrine of coverture still shaped the married woman's world, folding her legal identity into her husband's, and social custom folded the rest. Her opinions, her loyalties, and her public face all presumed to follow his. A wife who campaigned in her heart against her own husband's party in the most bitter election of the decade was doing something close to unthinkable. Alice did it without apology. She had decided long before that she would not be absorbed into anyone, not into her father's household as a girl, and not into her husband's as a wife. And the 1912 rupture was that decision tested at the highest stakes and holding firm. The marriage learned early that it had joined itself to a woman who would keep her own mind, even when keeping it cost the man beside her his seat. The marriage could absorb infidelity on both sides, but it also had to absorb a wife who kept her own political mind in a decade when a wife was expected to have none. Look closely at what she was doing across these years, because it is easy to miss inside a story about a difficult marriage. She was refusing, again and again, to be reduced to a wife. She kept her own name in the public mind, her own political loyalties, her own social standing that did not derive from her husband, and her own separate life inside the marriage. In an era that offered a married woman almost no legal identity apart from her husband, this was not a small thing. The doctrine of coverture, which had folded a wife's legal existence into her husband's for generations, was only slowly loosening, and the social expectations were tighter still. Alice lived inside those expectations and quietly declined to be contained by them, holding a public self that was entirely her own. What held such a marriage together, when affection had thinned and trust had gone, was a bargain neither of them ever wrote down. Divorce would have been a public catastrophe for a Roosevelt and a Longworth alike, unthinkable for people of their standing in that decade. And so the marriage became a thing to be administered rather than repaired. Each of them kept a separate life, separate friendships, separate pursuits, and each extended to the other. A hard tolerance that asked no questions it did not want answered. It was a cold arrangement, and it was a durable one, and it suited a woman who had learned in childhood that a household can carry an unspoken truth at its center and go on functioning around it. Alice did not expect the marriage to give her happiness. She expected it to give her a platform, and it did. The marriage, then, was two things at once, and both are true. It was a union of mutual disappointment, drinking, and infidelity on both sides, held together by the impossibility of divorce and by a hard tolerance. And it was the platform from which Alice ran an increasingly formidable public operation, keeping her celebrity, her politics, and her independence intact through all of it. She had married a charming and unfaithful man from a powerful family, and rather than let the marriage define her as a wronged wife, she used its shelter and its standing to build something of her own. What she built would soon place her at the exact center of American political life. In the same years that her husband climbed toward the height of his career, and a senator from Idaho began to appear more and more often wherever she was. Chapter 5. The second most powerful man in the Congress. By the middle of the 1920s, her husband stood at the head of the House of Representatives, and Alice stood at the head of Washington. Nicholas Longworth had rebuilt everything the 1912 disaster had cost him, and more. In 1925, he became Speaker of the House of Representatives, the 38th man to hold the office, and he would keep it until 1931. The Speaker of the House presides over an entire chamber of the Congress, controls its business, and stands near the very summit of the elected government. The charming, unfaithful violinist Alice had married against her father's quiet wishes, was now one of the most powerful men in the country, and Alice was the Speaker's wife. But the title that mattered most in those years was not the one she held by marriage. It was the position she had built for herself, and it had no official name. Alice Roosevelt Longworth had become the reigning hostess and social power of Washington, the woman whose drawing room mattered, whose approval carried weight, and whose ridicule could wound. She was the daughter of one of the most vivid presidents in living memory, the wife of the Speaker of the House, and a personality the whole country had followed for 2 decades. And she gathered all of that into a genuine center of gravity in the Capitol. Politicians came to her table because being received by Alice meant something, and being cut by her meant something too. The mechanism of that power is worth seeing clearly because it is easy to wave away as mere socializing. It was nothing of the kind. In an age when the real business of Washington was still done in drawing rooms and at dinners as much as in committee rooms, the woman who controlled the most desirable table in the city controlled a genuine node of political life. Alice decided who was brought together and who was kept apart, whose company was sought and whose was quietly declined. She traded in the one commodity that never loses value in a capital, which is judgment. The verdict on who was rising and who was finished, who was clever and who was a fool. Her wit was the instrument, sharp, quick, and quotable, and a line from Alice could travel across Washington by nightfall and fix a man's reputation in place. Look at what the office meant, and the height she had reached becomes concrete. The Speaker of the House presides over an entire chamber of the national legislature and stands among the highest figures of the elected government. And from 1925 to 1931, Nicholas Longworth held that chair and ran the House with a firm and confident hand. His name would in time be carved above one of the great office buildings of the Capitol. And the woman who sat at the head of his household was the same woman who sat at the head of Washington's social order. So that 2 summits, the official one her husband held, and the unofficial one she had built for herself, met inside a single marriage and a single house. What passed between the branches of the government passed very often across her table, and she listened, and she judged, and she remembered. The power was not abstract, and a single habit of hers shows how concrete it could be. Alice made it her business to know everyone worth knowing and to be present wherever the real talk happened, and she turned that knowledge into influence by deciding who was brought together at her table and who was left off the list. An invitation from her could signal that a rising man had arrived. Her pointed absence from someone's circle could suggest that a career was cooling. She dealt in access and in verdict, the 2 commodities a capital never stops needing, and she dealt in them from a position no opponent could attack because she held no office anyone could vote her out of. She could not be defeated at the ballot box because she had never needed the ballot box to begin with. Set the scene of her power at its full height, and the scale of it becomes plain. By the second half of the 1920s, she was married to the man who ran the House of Representatives. She was the daughter of a president whose memory still shaped her party. She had been a public figure for roughly 24 years, since the age of 17, longer than many of the men in Congress had been in public life at all. She presided over the social world of a capital city that governed a great and growing nation. And she did all of this without a single vote to her name, in a decade when American women had only just, in 1920, won the right to cast one at all. Her power was entirely informal, and it was entirely real. What makes this reign remarkable is exactly what made her early celebrity remarkable, only now grown to full maturity. She held no office and could hold none. The formal machinery of American power was closed to her at every door. And she had built, out of celebrity and marriage and wit and sheer force of personality, a position from which she influenced the men who did hold the offices, shaped reputations, and sat at the crossing point of the government. She had proven, across 2 decades, that an ambitious woman locked out of every formal room could build a room of her own that the powerful would come to. And it was precisely in these years of her fullest public standing, married to the Speaker, Queen of the Washington Salon, watched and quoted and deferred to, that the most private and most dangerous chapter of her life was quietly opening. The same drawing rooms where she reigned held a growing awareness of a particular senator who was very often in her company. The woman who controlled what all of Washington was permitted to know about everyone else was about to become the keeper of the one secret that touched her most nearly, and she would need every instrument she had ever built to hold it. The senator was from Idaho, and among the people who watched such things, his name and hers had already begun to travel together. Chapter 6. The Lion Who Came to Her Door. The most feared orator in the Senate chaired its Foreign Relations Committee for a quarter of a century, and he had fallen into the orbit of the Speaker's wife. His name was William Edgar Borah, and he was a figure of the first rank in American public life. Born on the 29th of June, 1865, he had come to the Senate from Idaho in 1907 and would hold his seat until his death, the longest-serving senator in the history of his state. For roughly 25 years, he chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of the most powerful positions in the entire Congress, from which he shaped the foreign policy of the United States. He was the great isolationist of his age, the leading voice against Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, and his oratory earned him a title that stuck for life. They called him the Lion of Idaho. This was the man whose life became entangled with Alice Roosevelt Longworth's. According to the research of her principal biographer, the relationship probably began sometime after March of 1920, when Alice was in her middle 30s and Borah was in his middle 50s, a senator of enormous stature at the height of his influence. It was a connection between two people who lived at the very center of Washington power, the daughter of one president and wife of a speaker on one side, and the chairman of the Senate's foreign policy on the other, and it ran for years. The measure of Borah's stature makes the entanglement far larger than a private affair. As chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he sat astride the nation's dealings with the entire world, the most powerful single voice in the Senate on questions of war, peace, and treaty. He had helped lead the fight that kept the United States out of the League of Nations after the Great War. For a quarter of a century, the country's foreign policy could not move far without reckoning with the Lion of Idaho, and this was the man privately bound to the wife of the Speaker of the House. The Speakership ran one chamber of the Congress. Borah's committee shaped the other chamber's word to the world. The two were joined, out of public view, through a single woman who moved between them so that an extraordinary share of the government's power touched, at its social center, the person of Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Here the story requires the greatest possible precision, because everything that follows depends on a distinction that is easy to blur and disastrous to lose. Among the insiders of Washington, the political and social circle in which Alice moved, the relationship was widely known. It was talked about, understood, traded as the kind of open secret that a small governing class always seems to carry. But it did not reach the general public as established fact. And this gap between what the insiders whispered and what the country knew is the exact space in which Alice operated. She lived at the center of a circle that knew, inside a nation that did not, and she managed the boundary between the two with a control that held for the rest of her life. The evidence of how openly the insiders spoke survives in the jokes, and the jokes are worth handling carefully because they are anecdotes about private wit and never confessions of anything. In Alice's own circle, the situation was encoded in wordplay. Friends are said to have referred to it as Aurora Borah Alice, folding the senator's name into the shimmer of the northern lights and her own name into the pun. Alice herself, quick and fearless as ever, is reported to have joked about the coming child that she ought to name the baby Deborah, so that the initiated would hear the senator's name sitting inside it. These lines are the banter of a woman audacious enough to laugh at the very thing she was concealing, and that is exactly the register of her whole character. But they prove only that the circle knew and joked. They are not admissions, and nothing direct from Alice ever settled the matter on the public record. What is striking is how the relationship could be, at one and the same time, an open secret and a buried one. Inside the small world that governed Washington, it was understood, spoken of, folded into the jokes. Beyond that world, it did not exist as fact. The same discretion that let the insiders share the knowledge kept it from ever hardening into a public certainty, and Alice tended that boundary with care, letting the circle believe it knew everything while the country was told nothing. It was a demonstration, years before the child ever came, of the exact skill she would soon need most, the management of the line between the whispered and the proven. The senator himself makes the story larger because Borah was not a marginal figure whose private life touched no one. He was one of the most important men in the Senate, a shaper of the nation's stance toward the entire world, a public moralist of famous rectitude. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Lion of Idaho, the scourge of the League of Nations, was privately bound to the wife of the Speaker of the House, and the small governing class of Washington understood it, and the country did not. Two of the highest positions in the American government, the Speakership of the House and the chairmanship of the Senate's foreign policy, were connected through the person of one woman, and that connection was among the best kept open secrets in the Capitol. Everything now was in place for the event that would test Alice Roosevelt Longworth more than any other. She was the daughter of a president, the wife of the Speaker of the House, the reigning social power of Washington, and the intimate of the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She held, in her single person, threads that ran into the executive, the House, and the Senate all at once, and she was about to face the one situation that could not be managed with wit alone, the one secret that would not stay abstract, because it was about to arrive in the world as a living child who would carry a name and need a father. What Washington had joked about was about to become a person. Chapter 7. The Child and the Joke Washington Told. When the baby came, Alice is said to have joked that she should name the girl Deborah, and the initiated heard the senator's name inside it. Paulina Longworth was born on the 14th of February, 1925. Alice was 41 years old, and this was her first and only child, arriving after nearly 2 decades of marriage. The date carried a weight that no one could have designed. The 14th of February was the very calendar day on which, 41 years earlier, Alice's own mother and her grandmother had both died. The day that had emptied her own life at its beginning was the day that filled it with a daughter. A woman who had come into the world in a house of double death gave birth, on the anniversary of that death, to the child who would become the great secret of her life. The child was given the Longworth name, and the world received her as the daughter of Nicholas and Alice Longworth. That is how it appeared, and that is how it was meant to appear. But the weight of the historical evidence, gathered and published long after everyone in the story was gone, indicates that Paulina's biological father was not Nicholas Longworth. It was William Borah. This is the fact the whole documentary turns on, and it must be carried exactly as the evidence carries it, as a conclusion established by later historians from the private papers, rather than as something proven or admitted at the time. The joke about naming the child Deborah is the emblem of the whole thing, and it repays a moment's attention. A cautious woman in Alice's position would have gone silent and grey, drawn no attention, prayed the talk would fade. Alice did the opposite. She made the joke herself, in her own circle, daring the knowing few to laugh with her at the very fact she was concealing from everyone else. It was audacity of a rare kind, the confidence of a woman who understood that the boldest way to hold a secret is sometimes to stand beside it and smile, so that no one imagines there is anything left to find. Because at the time, in 1925, the truth of the child's parentage was not public knowledge, and the distinction is everything. The affair had been rumoured and joked about among the Washington insiders, yes. But the paternity of the baby, the specific claim that the Speaker's wife had borne the child of the senator from Idaho, was not established public fact. It circulated at most as the kind of thing the knowing few believed and the country never heard. And there is one detail that proves how completely the truth was held. Paulina herself grew up believing that Nicholas Longworth was her father, and she went on believing it into adulthood. The person with the very greatest stake in the truth, the child at the centre of it, was not told. If the secret was kept from her, it was kept from everyone. Hold the two things side by side, because the script must never let them collapse into one. On one side, an affair that the insiders of Washington rumoured and encoded in their jokes. On the other, a paternity that was not public knowledge, that the child herself did not know, and that would not be established as historical fact for another 80 years. What Alice achieved in the gap between those two things was extraordinary. She lived openly enough that her own circle could joke about the senator, and she concealed the essential fact so completely that the country never had it and her own daughter never learned it. She let the world see the smoke, and never once let it prove the fire. There is a scale to this moment that is easy to miss. Alice was 41 years old and had been married for nearly 19 years when her only child arrived, at an age when many women of her time had long finished with childbearing. She had been a public figure for 24 years, since she was 17, longer than some of the men then sitting in Congress had been in public life at all. She was the daughter of a former president, the wife of a coming speaker, and the reigning social power of the capital. And into that blazing visibility, she brought a newborn whose very existence was the most dangerous fact of her life. Most people could not hide a private trouble for a single season. Alice would hide this one, in the fullest glare the country could turn on a woman, for the rest of her life. This was the discipline of her whole life brought to its single hardest test. As a child, she had learned that a family can hold a truth at its centre and never speak it. As a wife, she had learned to manage a marriage of open secrets without ever letting the public name them. Now she carried the largest secret of all, a secret that was not an abstraction or a rumour, but a daughter, a living person who would grow up inside the concealment, who would call another man father, and who would build a whole understanding of herself on a foundation her mother knew to be false. The cost of that, borne by the child, would come due in time. For now, in 1925, the achievement was pure control. Alice had converted the most dangerous fact of her life into a well-kept household truth, exactly as she had been trained to do since before she could remember. And so the point of no return was passed, quietly, in a Washington townhouse, on a Valentine's Day that echoed the one that had opened her own life. The secret was now a person. It could not be denied out of existence, and it could not be undone. It could only be managed every single day for as long as Alice lived, and it would have to be managed against the sharpest, most gossip-hungry society in the country, in front of a husband, in front of a growing child, and in front of a public that followed Alice's every move. What had been a rumour was now a life. The keeping of the secret had become the work of a lifetime. Chapter 8. The secret that had to be held every day. To keep the truth of her daughter's birth, Alice had to perform an unbroken discipline in the one city built to trade in exactly this kind of information. Washington was, and is, a capital that runs on who knows what about whom, a place where private facts are currency, and where a small class of insiders makes it their business to know the things the public does not. Into that city, Alice brought the single most exposing fact of her life, and she held it without a visible crack for decades. The scale of the discipline is hard to overstate. She was not concealing a brief lapse in a quiet corner. She was raising in plain sight at the center of the most watched social world in America, a child whose very existence was the evidence. The tools she used were the ones she had built across her whole life. The first was silence about the essential fact. Nothing direct from Alice on the truth of Paulina's paternity exists on the public record. There is no letter of confession made public in her lifetime, no admission, no moment where she set the truth down where the world could read it. What survives is the private banter, the jokes among the circle, and the arrangement itself, the child raised as a Longworth inside the Longworth marriage. She had learned as a girl that a truth can be everywhere in a house and never once be spoken, and she applied that lesson now with an adult's full command. The second tool was the very openness of her personality, which worked, paradoxically, as a kind of cover. Alice was famous for saying the outrageous thing out loud, for the sharp public wit, for a life lived in the newspapers. A woman so visibly candid, so willing to shock, is the last woman anyone suspects of holding the deepest secret of her life in perfect stillness. The reputation for saying anything concealed the fact that she was, on the one subject that mattered most, saying nothing at all. She could even let her circle joke about the senator, because a joke that everyone shares looks like the whole truth, and no one goes looking behind a secret that seems already told. Picture the city she was defeating. Washington in these years was a small town at heart, a governing class who all knew one another, dining in the same rooms, trading the same confidences, a place where a marriage, an illness, or an indiscretion became common knowledge among the insiders almost before it was over. It ran on private information as much as on public law, and Alice was one of its supreme practitioners, the woman whose drawing room decided which reputations rose and which were quietly buried. She knew exactly how a fact travelled in that town, how a single loose word could harden into a permanent verdict, because she spent her days turning other people's loose words into verdicts of her own. To hold a secret of this magnitude in such a place, for decades, was never a matter of luck. It was a matter of craft, practiced daily by a woman who understood the machinery of exposure better than almost anyone alive and turned that understanding to her own defense. And the hardest theatre of all was the daily one, performed at close range in her own house. A public can be managed from a distance, with a composed face and a careful word. A child cannot. Paulina was there every day, watchful in the way children are, and the concealment had to hold not only in the ballrooms of Washington, but at the breakfast table, across all the years of a girl growing up and sensing, as children do, the shape of the things adults will not say. That the secret held even there, even against the one witness with the most reason and the most chance to feel the fracture, is the final measure of how completely Alice governed it. understand the environment against which this was held, because it makes the achievement sharper. This was the same Washington where Alice herself reigned as the great trader in judgment and gossip, the woman whose drawing room fixed reputations. She knew better than almost anyone how fast a fact could travel in that city, how a single confirmed detail could define a person forever, because she had spent years being the one who defined others. She turned that knowledge inward and used it to protect herself. The mistress of Washington gossip became the perfect keeper of a Washington secret, precisely because she understood the machinery she was defeating from the inside. And it was held against the hardest possible witness, which was the child herself. Paulina grew up in the household believing Nicholas Longworth was her father, and that belief was allowed to stand into her adult life. Whatever the emotional truth of that home, and there are signs it was not a warm one, the essential fact was kept from the person it concerned most. To conceal a thing from the public is one order of difficulty. To conceal it from her own daughter, living in her own house, across all the years of that childhood and beyond, is another order entirely, and it demanded a control that never once relaxed in front of the one person best placed to sense that something did not fit. This is where the language of victimhood fails to describe Alice, and the language of strategy begins to fit. A woman who was merely trapped by a secret would show the strain of it, would slip, would be defined by the fear of exposure. Alice was defined by the opposite, by a mastery so complete that the secret simply held, year after year, as a settled fact of her life rather than a crisis in it. She had turned the most dangerous circumstance a woman of her time could face into one more thing she governed. But mastery of this kind is never free, and the price of it was being paid, quietly, by the child who was its subject, and by the two men whose lives were bound into it, one of whom was about to be taken from the story altogether. Chapter 9. The Man Who Raised Her Anyway. The documented fact, the one at the very heart of this story, is that Nicholas Longworth took Paulina in and raised her as his own daughter. Whatever the truth of her blood, and the evidence points away from him, the Speaker of the House accepted the child, gave her his name, and raised her within his family as his own. This is documented fact, the firm and uncontested centre of the whole account, and the quiet act the title of this story points toward. In a life full of concealment and calculation, this is the plain thing that stands on its own. A man raising a daughter and asking nothing the world could hear. Weigh what that act conferred, because it was substantial in every dimension. To be raised as Nicholas Longworth's daughter was to carry one of the old and powerful names of American public life, to hold a place inside a wealthy and established family, and to possess a legitimacy that a child of the other man could not have carried openly in that era. In a time when the circumstances of a child's birth could shadow an entire life, the Longworth name was a gift of standing, security, and belonging. Nicholas Longworth extended all of it to Paulina, not for a moment, but for the whole of the years he had with her. And the extension of that name and that place is the generosity the story is built to honor. Now the story reaches the point where precision matters most, and where the temptation to overreach must be refused. The question everyone wants answered is whether Nicholas Longworth knew that Paulina was not his biological child. And the honest answer is that no one can say for certain. The claim that he knew is the speculation of Alice's biographer, a plausible inference from a marriage of mutual knowledge and open secrets, but it is speculation and not established fact. The record does not contain his certainty. It contains his conduct. And so the script must hold the line exactly where the evidence holds it. What is documented is that he raised Paulina as his own. Whether he did so knowing the truth is a question the historian raises and cannot close, and it must be left as a question, never asserted as an answer. But notice how the uncertainty, held honestly, makes the act more moving rather than less. If Nicholas Longworth did not know, then he was simply a father raising his daughter, which needs no explanation. If he did know, as the biographer suspects, then his raising of Paulina becomes one of the quietest and most remarkable acts in the whole story. A man giving his name and his care to a child he had every reason to doubt. Inside a marriage that had wounded him as much as he had wounded it, and never making a public word of it. Understand what the gift of that name meant in that time, and its generosity grows. A child, born under a cloud of doubt about her parentage, carried, in that era, a stain that could follow her through every door in life, closing schools, marriages, and society against her. Legitimacy was no formality. It was a passport, and its absence was a quieter kind of life sentence. By taking Paulina in and raising her under the old and powerful name of Longworth, Nicholas Longworth handed the child far more than affection. He handed her a place in the world, a standing that the circumstances of her birth might otherwise have denied her entirely, the one thing his name could give that no amount of her mother's wit could purchase, which was belonging, unquestioned and secure. That is the shape of the generosity the title points to, and it held every day of the years he was given with her. There is a temptation, in a story shaped like this one, to sort the players into the wronged and the wrongdoers, and this man defeats the sorting. He had his failures, and they were not small, the drinking and the women that ran through the marriage as surely as Alice's own turning away. But set beside those failures is an act the ledger of blame cannot touch. He raised the child. Whatever passed between the husband and the wife, the girl in the house was given a father, and she was given him fully, for as long as he lived. A marriage can be a record of mutual injury and still hold, somewhere inside it, one plain and uncalculating kindness. And in this marriage, that kindness was his. The story does not need to resolve the question to feel its weight. It only needs to set the documented act beside the open question and let the viewer sit with both. There is a fairness owed to this man that the whole account depends on. It would be easy to make Nicholas Longworth only the deceived husband, the cuckold at the edge of a more glamorous drama. That would be false to the evidence and false to him. Whatever his failings, and they were real, the drinking and the women were part of the same marriage that wounded him. This is the man who raised the child. In a story about a woman who concealed a truth with extraordinary skill, the steadiest and most human power on display belongs to the husband who accepted the child and raised her as his own. The marriage was a ledger of mutual injury. The raising of Paulina sits outside that ledger, an act of care that the accounting cannot cancel. And this makes what came next fall all the harder on the child. For all the concealment around her birth, Paulina had, in Nicholas Longworth, a father who had taken her in and raised her, the one stable centre of her young life. She was a small girl who knew him as her father and knew nothing of the arrangement around her. She had time with him, and then, far too soon, she did not. The man who had given her his name and raised her as his own was about to be taken out of her life while she was still a child, and with his death, the first of the two men bound into her story would be gone, leaving the secret intact and the little girl at the centre of it more exposed than she could possibly understand. Chapter 10. The two men she buried. Within 9 years she lost them both, the man who gave her child a name, and the man the evidence says gave the child her blood. The first to go was her husband. Nicholas Longworth died on the 9th of April 1931 in Aiken, South Carolina, of pneumonia at the age of 61. He had been Speaker of the House until that year, a figure at the summit of the government, and now he was gone. Alice was widowed at 47, and she would remain a widow for the rest of her long life, another 49 years. But the heaviest weight of that death did not fall on Alice. It fell on the child. Paulina was 6 years old when the man she believed to be her father died, and she lost him without ever knowing the truth of what he had been to her, a man who had chosen to raise her. The second man went 9 years later. William Borah died on the 19th of January 1940 of a brain hemorrhage at the age of 74, still a senator, still the Lion of Idaho, having held his seat for 33 years. With his death, the other man bound into Paulina's story was gone, the one whom the later evidence would name as her biological father. Within 9 years, then, Alice had lost both of the men at the centre of the secret, the husband who had given her daughter a name, and the senator who, on the weight of the record, had given the daughter her blood. She was 55 years old, and the two men who had defined the great private drama of her life were both in their graves. What she did with those losses is entirely of a piece with everything she had done before. She said little for the record about either one. There was no public grief that opened the door to the truth, no confession offered in the license that mourning sometimes grants. The silence that had governed the secret in life governed it in death as well. She buried her husband, and 9 years later the other man died. And through both losses, Alice held the same discipline she had held for decades, giving the watching world nothing it could use to prove what it had only ever whispered. Mark the stature of the two men who died in those 9 years, because it measures the weight she carried alone afterward. One had been Speaker of the House of Representatives, near the summit of the elected government of the United States. The other had chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a quarter of a century, a shaper of the nation's stance toward the whole world. These were among the most powerful men in the country, and both were bound, in ways the public never fully knew, to the same woman. When Nicholas Longworth died in 1931, the newspapers mourned a speaker. When William Borah died in 1940, they mourned a lion of the Senate. Only Alice stood at the true centre of both losses, knowing what each man had been to her and to her daughter. And only Alice was required to grieve them both behind a surface that gave nothing away. There is a particular loneliness in a grief that cannot be told, and Alice knew it twice over in that decade. When a public figure dies, the people bound to him are allowed their mourning in the open, and the world reads their sorrow as tribute. Alice was allowed only the portion the secret permitted. She could grieve Nicholas Longworth as a widow grieves a husband, in full view, and she did. But the deeper truth of what the two men had been to her and to her daughter, the thing that would have made sense of her sorrow, was exactly what she could never show, and so a part of each mourning had to be swallowed whole and carried alone. She had buried, in 9 years, the two men at the centre of her life, and she had done it while performing a grief edited down to only what was safe to feel out loud. The keeping of the secret did not end when the men who shared it died. If anything, it became easier, because the two people most able to confirm it were now beyond any question. Set the scale of her endurance against the ordinary measure of a life, because it is genuinely remarkable. Alice Roosevelt Longworth would outlive her husband by 49 years. She would outlive William Borah by 40 years. She would, in time, outlive her only child by more than 20 years. She had come into the world in a house where death took 2 women in 2 days, and she would spend the length of her life burying nearly everyone who had shared its central facts, and standing over each grave with the same composed refusal to say the thing that would have explained it all. The girl, who had learned silence in a house that would not speak of the dead, became a woman who buried the living witnesses of her secret one by one and never broke. But there is a cost that ran alongside this endurance, and honesty requires naming it. The same silence that protected Alice isolated her. She could not mourn either man in the full truth of what he had been to her, because the truth was the very thing she was concealing. She could not let the public see the real shape of her grief, because its real shape would have told the story. A woman who has built her life around a secret pays for it precisely at the moments when other people are allowed to break, at the graveside, in the aftermath of loss, when the ordinary human release of speaking plainly is exactly what the secret forbids. Alice paid that price twice in 9 years, and she paid it without a visible tremor, and the paying of it was its own kind of loneliness. And still, the person who would pay the most had barely begun to. Paulina was growing up, a girl who had lost the only father she knew at 6, raised now by a mother whose gifts were composure and control rather than warmth, carrying without knowing it the weight of a secret that shaped everything about who she was. Her mother had buried 2 men and kept the discipline intact. The daughter's own life was still ahead of her, brief and hard and entirely her own, and it would test whether a secret kept perfectly by one generation could be survived by the next. Chapter 11. The daughter at the center of it. Paulina grew up believing the speaker was her father, and her own life would be brief and hard and entirely her own. She was the child the whole secret had been built around, and yet her life was not merely a footnote to her mother's. It had its own shape, its own choices, and its own quiet dignity. And the story owes her the same seriousness it gives Alice. She grew up in a household that the record suggests was not a warm one, the only child of a mother whose genius was for the public performance of composure and whose warmth did not come easily. She lost the man she believed to be her father when she was 6. She carried, without knowing it, the strangeness of a home organized around a fact she was never told. In the middle of the 1940s, she married. Her husband was Alexander McCormick Sturm, born on the 23rd of June, 1923, a young man of real and varied gifts. In 1949, he did something that would outlast him by generations. He provided the money and the design sense behind a new firearms company, co-founding Sturm, Ruger and Company, with a gifted designer named William Batterman Ruger, putting up the startup capital and creating the eagle emblem that the company would carry for the rest of its history. It was a real achievement, and it should have been the beginning of a long life. It was not. Alexander Sturm died on the 16th of November 1951 of viral hepatitis at the age of 28, leaving Paulina a widow with a young daughter. There is a particular direction in the choices Paulina made after her husband's death, and it deserves to be seen clearly rather than pitied. She turned toward a faith her mother's glittering, skeptical world had little use for, converting to Catholicism and finding in it a structure and a seriousness that the Washington of drawing rooms and sharp verdicts could not offer her. She gave herself to the raising of her small daughter and to volunteer work that asked nothing of celebrity. In a family defined by public brilliance and private concealment, Paulina reached instead for meaning, for devotion, for the quiet and unglamorous labors that leave no headline. Whatever burdens she carried, and the evidence suggests they were real, she carried them towards something, and the something she chose was the opposite of the performance her mother had perfected. Resist, one last time, the pull toward reading Paulina only as a casualty, because she was a person with a life of her own making. She had inherited her mother's name and her mother's world, the great houses and the famous connections, and she had turned away from much of it towards something quieter and, in its own way, braver. She chose a faith. She chose motherhood. She chose the unglamorous work of caring for others over the performance her family had perfected. Her years were few and they were hard, and within them she made choices that were entirely her own, and any honest account of her must hold those choices up as her achievement and not merely record how she died. The secret was her mother's. The life, brief as it was, belonged to Paulina. That daughter was Joanna Stuem, born in 1946, Alice's granddaughter, and in time, the great companion of her old age. But that was still to come. In the early 1950s, Paulina was a young widow, and she responded to her loss by turning toward things her mother's world had little use for. She converted to Catholicism, entering a faith that offered structure and meaning, and she gave herself to volunteer work and to the raising of her daughter. The best reading of the evidence is that she struggled in these years with depression and with alcohol, though that reading is one biographer's interpretation and should be held as such rather than asserted as clinical fact. What is clear is that her life was hard and that she carried it with a seriousness of her own. On the 27th of January, 1957, Paulina died. She was 31 years old. The cause was an overdose of sleeping pills, a barbiturate overdose, and here the story must hold to exactly what the sources support and no more. How that death should be understood is genuinely uncertain. Some accounts report the overdose without assigning any intent. Others describe it as a suicide. Others treat it as accidental or leave it undetermined. There is no single authoritative public verdict, and so the only responsible statement is the careful one, that Paulina died of a barbiturate overdose on that January day, and that the sources are divided on whether it was intended. The script must not reach past the evidence to call it what the evidence will not confirm. What must be refused here, above all, is the easy register of tragedy, because that register would flatten a real person into a lesson. Paulina Longworth was far more than the sad casualty of her mother's secret. She was a woman who married, who lost her husband young, who chose a faith, who raised a daughter, who did volunteer work that mattered, and who struggled, as many people struggle, with griefs and burdens that were partly her own and partly inherited. Her life was short, and it was difficult, and it was hers. The honest way to hold it is with dignity and specificity, as the human cost that sat at the center of a story about audacity and control, never as a fall staged for effect, and never dressed in the word tragic. And yet the cost is real, and it must be set down plainly, because it is the price attached to everything the earlier chapters admired. Alice Roosevelt Longworth held her secret with a mastery that defeated the most gossip-hungry city in America for the length of her life. The person who bore the weight of that mastery most directly was the daughter, who grew up on a foundation her mother knew to be false, who lost the father she believed in at 6, and who did not live to see 32. This is the breaking point of the whole story, the place where the brilliance of the concealment and the cost of it stand in the same frame and cannot be separated. Paulina was gone, and her mother, now in her 70s, would do the one thing left that could redeem any part of it. She would take in the granddaughter Paulina had left behind, and she would begin, in the open, the raising of the next generation. Chapter 12. The Grandmother and the Reign That Followed. In her 70s, she took in the granddaughter Paulina had left behind, and around her she built the last and longest of her thrones. When Paulina died in 1957, she left a daughter, Joanna Sturm, born in 1946, and Alice, then in her early 70s, took the girl in and raised her. There is a quiet symmetry in this that the whole story has been moving toward. The woman who had concealed the parentage of one generation spent her old age openly raising the next. Whatever had been hidden about Paulina's birth, there was nothing hidden about Joanna's place in Alice's house. The two had not been close at first, and across the years they grew close, and Joanna became the companion of Alice's final decades, the steady presence at the end of a very long life. Around that late domestic fact, Alice built the reign for which she is best remembered. Freed of her marriage by widowhood and outliving nearly everyone who had shared her secrets, she became the acid-tongued queen of the Washington salon, a power in her own right for decade after decade. Presidents and senators of both parties sought her table across the middle of the 20th century because to be received by Alice Roosevelt, Longworth was to be recognized, and to be cut by her was to be diminished. She was the keeper of her father's memory and the sharpest wit in the capital, and she wielded both as instruments of a standing that no election had ever granted and no defeat could ever take away. The instrument of that reign was the spoken line, and her most famous one told the whole truth about how she operated. She kept in her drawing room a cushion embroidered with the words that if you could not say something good about someone, you should come sit right there beside her. It was a joke, and it was also a complete philosophy of her power. She traded in judgment, in the sharp verdict on who was clever and who was a fool, who was rising and who was finished. And she made that trade the center of Washington's social life for as long as she lived. The wit that had made her a national character at 17 had become, by her old age, a form of authority that the most powerful people in the country came to court. The span of that late authority is difficult to credit from the outside. Alice had first entered public life in 1901, in the age of horse-drawn carriages and her father's larger-than-life fame, and she was still a courted power in the Washington of the 1960s and 70s, in the age of television and the jet. She had been a household name under Theodore Roosevelt and was still being sought out and quoted by figures born long after her own celebrity began. Presidents of both parties called on her or feared her tongue across the middle of the century, and a well-aimed line from Alice could still travel the capital by nightfall, exactly as it had in the 1920s. She had turned the wit of a rebellious girl into the standing of a national institution, and she held that standing for a length of time no elected office could ever match, because offices expire and personality does not. Measure the length of that reign, because it is almost beyond belief. Alice had first become a public figure in 1901, when her father entered the White House. She was still a genuine power in Washington in the 1960s and into the 1970s, more than 60 years later, having outlasted a long succession of presidents. She had been famous under Theodore Roosevelt and was still being quoted under presidents born after her own celebrity began. No office could have given her that. Offices change hands every few years. What Alice held, she held for the length of her life, because she had built it out of personality and judgment and name, the materials that do not expire with a term of service. And here the deepest pattern of her life comes fully into view. Everything she had taken from the one territory the law and the era left open to a woman, the territory of reputation, verdict, and the control of what people knew. She could not hold an office, so she made herself the woman whom the office holders needed. She could not cast a vote, so she made herself the judge of the men who did. She had learned as a motherless child that power lives in the management of what is spoken and what is withheld, and she practiced that lesson at the highest level for the better part of a century. The salon was the visible form of it. The secret she still carried, the truth of Paulina's birth, was the private form of the very same power held in the same hand. For the truth had not surfaced, even now. Paulina was dead. Both men were dead. And still the fact of the child's parentage stayed where Alice had always kept it, out of the public record. A thing the insiders had once whispered, and the country had never been able to prove. Alice Roosevelt Longworth would die on the 20th of February 1980 in Washington, at the age of 96, having outlived her husband by 49 years, William Borah by 40, and her only child by more than 20. She carried the secret to the grave. It would take the opening of the private papers and a historian willing to read them before the country finally learned what Washington had only ever guessed. Chapter 13. The papers that told the truth at last. For 80 years, the parentage of Paulina Longworth lived only as rumour, until a biographer opened the family papers and set it down as fact. The rumour had circulated among the knowing few since the 1920s, and then it had faded, as such things do, into the kind of half-remembered gossip that dies with the people who traded it. Alice had kept it out of the record for the whole of her life, and when she died in 1980, the truth might well have gone with her, one more secret dissolved by time. It did not. In the year 2007, the historian Stacey Cordery published a biography titled Alice, drawing on family documents and on Alice's own papers, and in it she established what the insiders had once whispered as documented historical fact. Paulina's biological father was William Borah, not Nicholas Longworth. The book that finally spoke it was a serious work of history rather than a whisper repeated. Stacey Cordery's biography, titled Alice, From White House Princess to Washington Power Broker, was published in the year 2007, and it rested on the very things Alice had spent her life controlling, the family documents and her own private papers. What had lived for generations as the belief of a knowing few became, in those pages, a conclusion drawn from the record and set down as the standard historical view. The irony sits at the heart of it. The written word, which Alice had governed so carefully in life, releasing only what she chose and holding back the rest, was in the end the thing that told the truth she had withheld. And it did so only after the papers had outlived her, and only when no one who could be wounded by them remained to be wounded. The importance of that gap, 80 years wide, is not a detail to pass over. It is central to the entire meaning of the story. Paulina was born in 1925. The truth of her parentage was established in 2007. For more than 8 decades, across the whole life of the child and the whole long life of the mother and well beyond both, the fact stayed hidden, kept first by Alice's living discipline and then by the simple silence of the grave. That a private truth could be held for 80 years in the most watched capital in the country by a woman who was herself one of the most famous people in America is the final measure of how completely Alice governed what the world was permitted to know. Consider how the truth finally came out, because the manner of it closes the story with a kind of justice. It did not come from a confession. Alice never made one. It did not come from either of the men, who died decades earlier and said nothing for the record. It came from the papers, the private documents that outlived everyone, read at last by a historian long after the people they concerned were beyond embarrassment or harm. The very thing Alice had spent her life controlling, the written and spoken record, was in the end what told the truth, but only on a delay of 80 years, only when there was no longer anyone alive to be wounded by it. Even the exposure of her secret waited, as if out of deference, until the whole cast of the drama had left the stage. The truth, once established, reordered the way everyone in the story is remembered, and each reassessment is worth naming. Nicholas Longworth, long remembered chiefly as a Speaker of the House, is now remembered also as the man who raised a daughter the evidence says was not his own, and that quiet act has become, for many who learn it, the most human thing about him. William Borah, the public moralist and Lion of Idaho, now stands with the private relationship the record documents set beside his rectitude, and Alice herself, long treated as a colourful footnote to her father, a wit and a personality and little more, has been reassessed as something far more serious, a woman who exercised real power in an age that denied women any legitimate form of it, and who kept the largest secret of her life with a mastery that outlasted the century. There is one more thing the papers restored, and it is the thing this whole account has tried to honour. They restored Paulina to the centre of her own story. For as long as the truth was hidden, Paulina was simply the daughter of Nicholas and Alice Longworth, a sad figure at the edge of a famous family. With the truth established, her life takes on its real shape and its real weight. The child born on the anniversary of a double death, given a name that was a kind of shelter, raised on a foundation she was never allowed to see, loved imperfectly, lost too early, and finally understood. The 80-year silence had kept not only Alice's secret, but Paulina's true story, and the opening of the papers gave the daughter back the truth of her own life long after she could know it. And so the secret that had organized a whole life was finally spoken, not by the woman who kept it, but by the record she could not control forever. Alice had won every round of the contest while she lived. The last round, played out a generation after her death, went to the papers. What remained was to ask what it had all meant, what a life like hers reveals about power and its price, and what a woman who was denied every office and yet ruled the story of her own life made possible for the women who came after her. Chapter 14. What the keeper of the secret made possible. She could not vote when she became the most famous woman in America, and yet she governed the one territory no law could reach. This is the reckoning her life demands, and it is time to state it plainly. Alice Roosevelt Longworth held no office and could hold none. She commanded no fortune structured in her own name. She cast no vote in any chamber, and for the first 36 years of her life, American women could not vote at all. By every formal measure the century used to record power, she should register as powerless. And yet she stood at the crossing point of the executive, the House, and the Senate, ruled the social life of the capital for 6 decades, and kept a secret so completely that the truth waited 80 years for the papers to open. The formal ledger of power has almost nothing to say about her. The real ledger has almost nothing larger. Her power worked through the one channel her era left open to a woman, and she is the proof of how much that channel could carry. She could not seize an office, so she seized the thing offices depend on, which is reputation, attention, and the control of what people know. She calculated. She positioned. She deployed the assets she was permitted to own, her fame, her wit, her name, her judgment, and she held the assets she was forbidden to reveal in a silence that never once broke. The secret of Paulina's birth was the private masterpiece of exactly the same power that made her the queen of the Washington Salon. Both were the work of a woman who understood, earlier and more deeply than almost anyone of her time, that whoever controls the story holds a power that no vote can grant and no defeat can strip away. She did not ask permission to hold that power, because permission was never on offer to a woman of her time. She did not wait to be invited into the rooms where the country was run, because a woman like her was not invited into them. She built her own room instead, and made the powerful come to it, and she decided inside that room what a whole city would believe. Every woman who has ever turned a constraint into an instrument, who has built real authority out of the one thing she was allowed to hold, who has governed from inside a life that was supposed to leave her no power at all, is standing on ground that Alice Roosevelt Longworth walked first, in a headscarf of cigarette smoke, laughing at the very secret she was keeping perfectly still. And here the cost must be set down beside the mastery, because her story will not allow the one without the other. The same control that made her powerful required a child to grow up on a foundation she was never shown. The same silence that defeated the gossip of Washington also meant that Alice could never mourn either man in the full truth of what he had been to her, and that her own daughter lost the father she believed in without ever learning what that father had chosen to be. The discipline that was her triumph was also the thing that isolated her at every graveside and shaped, in ways no one can fully weigh, the brief, hard life of the person she loved and concealed at once. She proved what a woman denied every office could still command. She also proved what that command exacts, and the bill for it fell, as such bills so often do, on the child. Return, at the last, to the 14th of February. It was the day her own life had been emptied, when a mother and a grandmother died in a single span of hours, and a father drew a heavy line across his diary and closed the subject forever. And it was the day, 41 years later, when Alice gave birth to the daughter who would become the great secret of her life, a secret she would carry for another 55 years and take almost to the grave. The girl who was born into a silence grew into the woman who commanded one, and the same calendar day held both the wound and the concealment, the beginning she could not ask about, and the truth she would never tell. She had spent her whole life deciding what the world would be allowed to know, and she kept that authority to the end, longer than any office, longer than any man, longer than her own child. The cushion in her drawing room told the joke that was also her creed, that if you could not say something good about someone, you should come sit right beside her. It was the line of a woman who ruled by the verdict and the withheld word, and it is as good an epitaph as she ever had. History records the men who held the offices, and it was slow to record the woman who held the story, because a power that works through silence leaves almost no trace, which is exactly why it is so easily missed and exactly why it worked so long. But the truth is in the papers now, and it changes the ledger. The most powerful person in the room was often the one with no title at all, laughing, watching, and keeping her own counsel. And the question her life leaves behind is what became possible for the women who came after her. Once the world finally understood that her silence had never been weakness, it had been the strategy all along, and the strategy had won. If a life like this changes how you see the women history filed under a man's name, subscribe to Feminine Legacies so the next one reaches you. And tell me in the comments, do you think Alice's silence about Paulina was the price of her power? Or was it the purest power she ever held? I want to hear how you read her.